stand, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
We tend to see John Kennedy as youthful, glamorous, and vaguely progressive. But the day he died, we lost an invaluable treasure. We lost a man of peace who tried to get the American people to see our Cold War enemies not as despicable, inhuman monsters, but as people like us.
No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science, space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
And, though you're probably not aware, you lost the man who saved your life on October 17, 1962. U.S. spy planes had photographed Russian missiles in Cuba capable of hitting Washington and the entire East Coast. Kennedy announced a blockade of Cuba.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
And Kennedy's generals and advisors were telling him that he and they should slip away to the safety of bomb shelters, attack the missile sites, and then launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They assured Kennedy that the Russian missiles were not ready, but that they should all go to bomb shelters anyway, just to be safe, and leave the rest of us out to die. Kennedy thought about it, and then he told them that nobody was going anywhere, that if anyone died, they would be the first to go, sitting as they were in the White House, the prime target of those Russian missiles. And Kennedy suggested that, with this new perspective, they should all work out another, safer plan. It turns out that the generals were wrong. The Russian missiles were not only ready, they were armed with nuclear warheads, which the local commanders were authorized to use if attacked. Kennedy saved the world and you from nuclear holocaust that day, a holocaust that almost certainly would have killed everyone in the Northern Hemisphere. Eisenhower warned us that the greatest threat to American security came from
the military-industrial complex.
And Kennedy heard him. And then he called on the world to strengthen the United Nations organization, to help them not just to rein in the military-industrial complex, but to eliminate it completely. Before he died, Kennedy told the United Nations,
For in the development of this organization rests the only true alternative to war. And war appeals no longer as a rational alternative. For a nuclear disaster spread by wind and water and fear could well engulf the great and the small, the rich and the poor, the committed and the uncommitted alike. Mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. It is therefore our intention to challenge the Soviet Union, not to an arms race, but to a peace race, to advance together, step by step, stage by stage, until general and complete disarmament has been achieved. Under the eyes of an international disarmament organization, a steady reduction in force, both nuclear and conventional, until it has abolished all arms and all weapons, except those needed for internal order and a new United Nations peace force. And it starts that process now, today, even as the talks begin. Never have the nations of the world had so much to lose. or so much to gain. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
What a terrible crime and what a terrible loss to lose this man. And, as we should be, the world is still haunted by our failure to act. On November 22nd, 1963, the day he was shot, John Kennedy also lost a lot of things. He lost his beautiful wife. He left without saying goodbye to his lovely children. And although we don't think about it much, he lost the ability to have any effect on what the history books would say about him. Napoleon said that history is written by the winners, but I don't think we really appreciate what that means. If I'm rich and powerful, and my thugs murder you, and wipe out your family and all your friends and all of the witnesses, I am going to have much more to say about your history when it is written than you are. The killers get to write history, the victims get written about, and with his murder, John Kennedy lost the ability to have any effect on what the history books would say about him. He became one of the victims who get written about. I wonder what he would say about his killers if he could speak.
Before you rise at the trademark, it appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill.
The most shocking thing about the assassination is not the brutality of it. It was brutal, certainly. But the most amazing thing is the way the established media today managed to pretend that there is any question of whether his murder was a conspiracy. We need to understand the images we've been looking at. This is Dealey Plaza, the scene of the crime. This is the school book depository building and the 6th floor window from which Oswald supposedly did his shooting. Abraham Zapruder was standing here with his home movie camera when he took the graphic pictures you just saw of the assassination, the Zapruder film. And this is the so-called grassy knoll. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The official government version of the murder, the Warren Commission report, found that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Dallas School Book Depository building. They tell us that the first shot missed, that the second shot hit both Kennedy and the governor of Texas, and that the third shot, from behind, hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. But common sense tells you that a shot from the rear ought to have driven Kennedy forward. But instead we see him driven backward and to the left. It seems obvious that this shot came from the right front, from the so-called grassy knoll. In fact, all the witnesses near the knoll thought that there was a shot from that direction. These people are standing in front of the grassy knoll, and they are ducking because they heard a shot fired over their heads. The people you see running are running toward the grassy knoll, heroically trying to catch the assassins. If Kennedy had actually been shot from behind, as the government says, he ought to have a small entrance wound on the back of his head. And this is the Navy doctor that the government got to write this report, saying that Kennedy did have this small wound in the back of his head. But there are some things you should know about this doctor. In a standard examination, he should have examined Kennedy's clothing for bullet holes. He didn't. In a standard autopsy, he should have dissected all of Kennedy's wounds to trace the bullet's path. He didn't dissect any of Kennedy's wounds. He didn't even realize that Kennedy had a throat wound. He later claimed that these drawings of his were wrong and that the wounds were actually much higher. He lost Kennedy's brain, which is still missing, and then he burned his notes. He burned his notes. But perhaps we shouldn't be too hard on him, because this doctor, James Humes, had never done an autopsy involving gunshot wounds before in his life. So naturally, he was the government's first choice to perform the most important autopsy in American history. Dr. Humes' story about a small entrance wound in the back of Kennedy's head is today the official government version. But this is not the story that the New York Times told on the day that Kennedy died. On the left in this picture, we see the renowned New York Times reporter Tom Weicker in Dallas outside Parkland Hospital. He spoke to the doctors who had been called to the emergency room to treat the president, and his story later appeared the same day on the front page. His article states, later in the afternoon, Dr. Malcolm Perry, an attending surgeon, and Dr. Kemp Clark, chief of neurosurgery at Parkland Hospital, gave more details. Mr. Kennedy was hit in the throat just below the Adam's apple, they said. This wound had the appearance of a bullet's entry wounds on the front. Mr. Kennedy also had a massive gaping wound in the back and one on the right side of the head. The wound on the right was the entry for the shot from the grassy knoll. The wound in the back was the exit for that bullet that sent Kennedy's brains flying. This is Malcolm Kilduff, Kennedy's assistant press secretary, who was with him in Dallas. He also spoke to the doctors immediately after Kennedy's death, and then he called this press conference.
Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of gunshot wound in the brain.
He had not yet heard the words school book depository or grassy knoll. All he knew was what the doctors had told him.
Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
The doctors had told him that Kennedy was struck by a bullet from the front right that hit him in the right temple, went right through his head, and exited the back. The Dallas emergency room doctors have been unanimous in describing a large exit wound in the back of Kennedy's head.
I was probably looking into a wound that was on the lateral or the side part of the head and the back part of the head.
It would be this portion of the head right here.
Remember, it's like this, that there was a big wound, big deficit in its skull and the temporal parietal area.
If you listen carefully, you will even hear Walter Cronkite admit that the autopsy photos show this large hole in the back of Kennedy's head.
The drawing was approved by Dr. McClellan, one of the attending physicians in Dallas. The drawing suggests what many of the photos examined by the doctors in Nova show, a large wound about this size and location.
There is really no room for debate on this point. Kennedy had a huge exit wound in the back of his head because the shot that killed him came from the front and could not have been fired by Oswald, who was behind the president. This information did not start off as a secret. It was made into a secret by the constant authoritative denial of the truth. The people who killed the president and got away with it 40 years ago were obviously very powerful then. But the history books and the news people are still lying to us about these events. Are some of these killers still alive? Are they still so powerful that they can force leading news people and historians to lie to protect them? Apparently, the ones who are still alive are still very powerful people. Can we help to give John Kennedy a voice? To write his history as he would have written it? I think we owe it to him to try. Certainly he deserves better than the fairy tale put forward by the government and the history books that Kennedy was brought down by a powerless minimum wage nobody. The truth is nearly the opposite of what we have been told, and it is a textbook lesson in what it looks like when real power kills.
Ordinarily, a unit of military, I think was called a Special Group Number 113, would have come up from San Antonio, Texas, and would have been deployed all through the streets of Dallas, the important streets of Dallas. That was not done. In fact, the commander was specifically told he wasn't needed.
Secret Service regulations require that any time the president's car slows down below 44 miles per hour, the security must be poured on.
You've all seen the picture of the school book building, where Oswald is supposed to have shot the president. You notice in those pictures there are open windows. If the Secret Service had been there and had done their usual job, none of those windows would have been open. And had anyone opened one of those windows at that time, they would have been on the radio, they would have had a man in that room immediately, and the window would have been closed. You see, that's protection. That didn't take place. In fact, there were no Secret Service people on the ground around Dealey Plaza that afternoon. They were told they were not needed.
What are we looking at here? Handles on the back of the president's limousine? Why? Normally in a motorcade, Secret Service agents would be riding on the back of his car and run along beside him whenever the car slowed down. In Dallas, these agents were ordered to abandon their positions. They didn't agree with it, they didn't like it, but they followed their orders. President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas. The murder investigation, including the autopsy, should by law have taken place in Dallas. But we saw that Kennedy's official government autopsy was performed instead at the Bethesda Navy Hospital near Washington, D.C., by an amateur who didn't probe any of the wounds, who somehow didn't even see the enormous exit wound that all the doctors in Dallas saw, and who burned his notes when he was done. The Secret Service stole Kennedy's body from the Dallas coroner and loaded it on to Air Force One. And what happened next is difficult to believe. David Lifton has done an extensive examination of the time period between when the body was loaded onto the plane and when it arrived in Washington for the autopsy. He found this report, written by 2 FBI agents present at the autopsy. The report says that it was apparent that surgery to the head area had been performed before the autopsy started. Surgery to the head before the autopsy? 2 FBI agents are telling us that somewhere between the Dallas emergency room and the Bethesda Naval Hospital, someone casually walked up to Kennedy's casket, got out a knife, and began cutting on the president's head? But the Secret Service was all over the president's casket. How could this have happened? Lifton spent his life researching this question, and he found the answer. Lifton interviewed Aubrey Reich at the O'Neill Funeral Home. On the day of the assassination, Reich's job included loading the president's body into a large bronze casket.
I helped put President Kennedy's body in a bronze ceremonial casket on November 22nd, 1963, at Parker Memorial Hospital.
This bronze ceremonial casket was then illegally taken by the Secret Service and loaded onto Air Force One. But when the body arrived at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, it was removed from a very different-looking coffin by Navy autopsy technician Paul O'Connor.
We opened the pinkish gray shipping casket. There was a gray body bag, zipped shut. We unzipped the body bag, and the president's body was lifted out of the body bag.
Reich also told Lifton that he did not put Kennedy's body into a body bag in Dallas. Lifton asked him how he could be so certain about what he remembered.
I remember picking him up. I was one that had the blood on my shirt and everything from the body. If he'd been in a crash bag, you couldn't got any blood on him because it's a sealed bag.
Now, there were not a dozen men working at Parkland Hospital whose job was to put bodies into caskets. There was one. There were a couple of men at Bethesda who unloaded the president's body, and Paul O'Connor was one. These 2 men are the best witnesses available who could answer the question. Their word has to be considered the best evidence. No other credible witness has ever contradicted their testimony on the subject. So, if you have any respect for the evidence, as sad a story as it is to tell, it seems that while the president's brother and widow were keeping a sad watch over an empty casket, someone, somehow, performed the grisly task of changing the wounds on the front of the president's body in order to destroy the evidence that Kennedy was shot from both the front and the back. These are incredibly serious charges, with absolutely enormous implications. These charges are not believable, are they? I mean, how could the president's body possibly have gotten from one casket into another? Are we supposed to believe that a couple of criminals just walked up to the casket in front of all those Secret Service men with all those guns and walked out with the body? Ridiculous, no? Okay, the FBI memo is powerful evidence, but the agent who wrote this must have made a mistake. Can we verify? Can we corroborate what the memo says about apparent surgery? Maybe the photos taken at Bethesda before the autopsy started will show the surgery referred to in this memo. Clearly, the FBI agents were not referring to the left side of the president's head. If there's any surgery here, it is certainly not apparent. But now look at this autopsy photo of the right side of Kennedy's head. So, what do you think? Do you see what the FBI agents saw? Do you see apparent surgery in this photo? Well, you're no expert, but this is certainly what any amateur might call apparent surgery. In fact, it doesn't look like a bullet wound at all. It looks like some Boy Scout got out his pocket knife and crudely cut a V in the president's scalp and then ripped the skin back. But why? Looking at a black and white version, it is possible to see a probable bullet hole here. This is also, by the way, where the president's press secretary said that the president was shot. So we have strong reason to believe that there is an entrance wound on this part of the president's head, and that the surgery we see here was an attempt, as Lipton says,
to obliterate any evidence of frontal entry.
There's a critical point that needs to be stressed about this photograph. Immediately after Paul O'Connor unzipped the body bag and removed the president's body from the shipping casket, he placed the president's body on an examination table to be photographed, as is routine, to create a record of what the body looked like before the autopsy. And this picture was taken at that time, before Dr. Humes began cutting the body up as part of the autopsy. So this photo ought to show the president's head in exactly the same condition as it was when it left Dallas. Does it? Was the crude cutting and ripping we see here done in Dallas, or did it somehow mysteriously appear somewhere on the road to Washington? This is an absolutely critical question. 25 years after the assassination, the people at Nova got the bright idea to find the Dallas physicians who examined Kennedy in the emergency room in Parkland Hospital and fly them into Washington to the National Archives to take a look at these photos taken immediately after Kennedy's body arrived in Washington, but before the autopsy began. They're going to answer this question for us. Do the photos taken before the autopsy show the body as they left it? Or did someone somehow, informally and illegally cut slices into the president's head?
I would have to say, honestly, in looking at these photos, they're pretty much as I remember President Kennedy at the time, except for that little incision that seems to be coming down in the parietal area.
He's telling us that Kennedy's head wound was altered.
I could envision that an incision might have been made in order to pull the scalp back to expose this bone.
As outrageous as it seems to be saying so, if we're going to be fair, if we're going to honor the evidence and go where it takes us, that would seem to settle the question. We have the FBI memo, expert eyewitness testimony, and the photo itself, taken before the autopsy started, all showing this crude cutting and ripping in this critical area of the fatal shot. Someone operated on this wound to Kennedy's right temple, the entrance for the bullet that went right through the head and blew out the back of Kennedy's skull. But how? How did the monsters who did this cutting and ripping get access to the body? And when? And where? And who done it?
An Air Force officer claims the body could not have been switched because the casket was in his view for all but 5 minutes of the journey from Dallas to Bethesda.
Well, there you go. While everyone on Air Force One was gathered in the front of the plane for 5 minutes watching President Johnson being sworn in, for example, the agents of evil snatched the body out of the casket and snuck it off the plane. But you know, it doesn't really matter when and where and how it was done. What matters is who. Who could have done it? Some intelligent, apparently honest people would like to blame the assassination on the Mafia, or the Cubans, or even the Russians. But this story of the president's body throws all those theories out of the window, doesn't it? I mean, After the president's murder, we would imagine that the FBI and Secret Service agents would be under a super heightened state of alert, trying to make up for letting the president die by now at least protecting his body. Who could have penetrated this security in order to steal and mutilate the body?